When I became a GP, I took over a single-handed practice which had been run for about 40 years by a rather truculent but good-hearted Scotsman. He'd run his practice from 2 downstairs rooms in the terraced house where he lived. He carried on living in the upstairs portion of the house, and I took over the consulting room, which had many years before been the dining room, and the waiting room, which should have been the sitting room if the house had been arranged more normally. Together with the single receptionist secretary, whom I had inherited with the practice, I spent much of my first week sorting through the drawers and cupboards and burning or dumping a huge amount of stuff that my predecessor didn't want and had left behind, but that I certainly had no use for. The receptionist secretary seemed to me to be about 150 years older. She was probably a little bit younger than that, and she'd been with the practice since the dawn of time. She was slightly scatty and panicked a little, but she was invaluable, since she was the only person in the world who understood how the filing system for the patient's records was designed and constructed, and how it worked. In her absence, it was quite impossible to find any medical records at all, and anyone who assumed that the filing was done alphabetically by name or address was doomed to failure. Alan Turing would not have worked it out. In those days, medical records were kept on bits of cardboard in a cardboard envelope. They were written in ink. Patients who visited the surgery often, or who had chronic illnesses, often had bulging records envelopes, which were an inch or more thick. Occasionally I'd go through the notes and throw out for burning all the unnecessary duplicates of referral letters and letters from hospitals. I once had trouble with an NHS inspector who arrived and demanded to take all the records to be analysed for some reason or other. Since this would have meant trying to run the practice without any records, I told him he couldn't take the records away, but he pointed to a line at the bottom of each card which said, "Property of the NHS." Remembering Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, I appeared to relent and told him he could take the records cards, but that he'd have to leave the ink, because the ink was mine. He was very puzzled by this, but after some harumphing and a few threats, he disappeared and never came back. I always had a consistent hate-hate relationship with all medical bureaucrats. My panicky secretary and I sorted through cupboards full of old prescription pads, out-of-date sick notes, books full of death certificate stubs, and nothing else, notepads provided by drug company reps, which carried advertisements for antibiotics, antidepressants, and a number of different proprietary tonics, cheap ballpoint pens emblazoned with ads for products that had long been withdrawn from sale, golf balls which carried the name of a drug company, sheets of blotting paper, calendars going back to just after the Second World War, diaries that might have been useful if 1953 ever comes back, bottles which had once contained ink but which now contained a blue-black sludge, old newspapers and magazines given away by publishers who made their money out of selling ads to drug companies, a decade's worth of rolled-up copies of the British Medical Journal which had never been opened, and a box full of little plastic gadgets for which I couldn't perceive any use or value. I found an old oil drum, and my receptionist and I began a bonfire that lasted for 3 days. My predecessor had never used an appointment system, and I didn't either. Things were very simple in those days. Patients turned up at the advertised surgery times and they waited to be seen. Everyone was seen within an hour or two of arriving. Patients were given a number so that they knew where they were in the queue. Many would take a number, provided, I seem to remember, with a roll of raffle tickets, and then, having judged how long they'd have to wait, would totter to the local shops. The system worked incredibly well and was very simple. There was no need for patients to ring up. We didn't need a huge appointments book. There was no problem with emergencies or requests for an urgent appointment, and everyone was seen when they needed to be seen. There were no 3-week waits for appointments. This worked too well, of course, and so eventually strict orders came down from on high that I had to introduce an appointment system of my own. The patients now had to ring up and fix an appointment, and they hated it, and so did I, not least because I had to put in another phone line and hire 2 more receptionists to answer the calls and deal with all the paperwork. But the bureaucrats, who hated all patients and loathed all doctors, were very happy with the appointment system and thought it as much fun as a bowl of sticky toffee pudding with a big dollop of whipped cream on top. I quickly discovered that my now retired predecessor had a couple of quirks. First, he'd prescribed high blood pressure tablets for almost all of the 2,500 patients in the practice. I've no idea why he did this. A normal blood pressure is usually regarded as being 120/80, the figure of 120 being the systolic pressure and the figure of 80 being the diastolic pressure. At the time, it was usually thought that patients only needed tablets if their diastolic pressure was over 100. However, I think there might have been a little confusion somewhere along the line because my predecessor had given tablets to everyone with a systolic pressure over 100. Since most of these people had perfectly normal blood pressure, which the drugs had lowered to an uncomfortable degree, the result was that I was constantly besieged by patients complaining that they were dizzy and kept falling over. Things weren't helped by the fact that the sphygmomanometer which I had inherited was woefully inaccurate. It was so inaccurate I put it in the bin along with the plastic gadgets and the perished stethoscopes. I obtained a new blood pressure machine and managed to cure my patients' hypotension by taking them off their entirely unnecessary tablets. This did my reputation no harm at all. I didn't want to suggest that my predecessor was in some way incompetent or flaky, so I told everyone that their course of treatment had proved successful, that they were cured, that they could therefore stop taking the tablets. They were all very grateful. The other problem, which I never got close to understanding, was that my retired predecessor had also told most of his patients, who had now become my patients, to have their shoes fitted with a raise on one side. This was sometimes done with an addition to the heel of a shoe and sometimes done with something called an inner raise, a piece of soft rubber or some other squishy material, which was placed inside the shoe and which must have been terribly uncomfortable. The choice of shoe to be raised seemed to be arbitrary, with some having their right shoe dealt with and some having their left shoe adapted. Naturally, those who had more than one pair of shoes were put to some considerable expense, because all these adaptations fell outside the remit of the National Health Service. The result of these changes was that all the patients walked around in circles. Try walking with one shoe higher than the other when you don't need it, and you'll see what I mean. Since the patients with the raised shoes were also receiving high blood pressure tablets, which they didn't need, the result was that around 2,000 people in a small town in the English Midlands were walking around in circles and falling down a good deal. Oh dear. On reflection, I'm surprised that some bright spark working at the local hospital didn't diagnose an epidemic of some rare neurological condition. Anyway, I managed to cure the patients of their tendency to walk around in circles by telling them to throw away their inner raises or to have their extra shoe heels removed. Once again, I told all the patients that they were now cured. And there was a third quirk too. When my predecessor had a disagreement of any kind with a patient, he would write psychopath on their medical records in blue ink and very large letters, so that there could be no mistaking it. Around a fifth of the patients had their medical records envelope decorated in this way. Since patients were usually entrusted with bringing their records into the surgery, they clearly found this embarrassing. I didn't think any of my patients really were psychopaths, certainly not 500 of them, so I tried to help a little by attempting to remove the inscriptions. I tried ink eradicator, but it didn't work, so I simply cut the tops off the medical record envelopes. The patients concerned, quite a few of whom had responsible jobs in the town, and were also worried because people had noticed that they had a tendency to walk around in circles and to fall over. We're very grateful. These days I wonder what quirks I might have had and what my successor might have thought of my prescribing habits. I've never had the nerve to try to find out, and I've been retired from practice for so long now that I rather suspect that my immediate successor has himself or herself probably retired too. And of course, all my scribbled notes would have long ago disappeared, because I suspect that all the medical records will have been put into a computer for everyone and his dog to access and peruse whenever they like. When I was in practice, my cardboard record envelopes were kept in drawers and boxes, and my receptionist's filing system was so individual in its design that the records couldn't have been safer or less accessible if they'd been stored in the Bank of England. I have long been convinced that not all progress is progress as I understand it, but then I suspect that most people would now describe me as an old fogey and long since out of fashion. The medical authorities, who heartily disapprove of experience, long ago decided that I'd passed my use-by date. Still, when I think about it, I suspect that making your patients walk around in circles and fall over occasionally was probably considerably less damaging than some of the things doctors do to their patients these days. And of course, we're not allowed to talk about the stuff that's happening these days. Please visit my channel on brand YouTube to watch other videos by me. And please visit my websites, vernoncoleman.org and vernoncoleman.com. Thanks for watching. An old man in a chair.